Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this week's roundtable. We are in Mark chapter 15. So, Edmund, without any further ado, let me find
15, you said.
Yeah, hang on a minute. I will find exactly where we're going to go. We are going to start. We're going to recap. Here's Dave. We are going to recap. And if you could do actually 33 right the way through to 47.
33 to 4. At noon, darkness covered the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 3, he uttered a loud cry, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you deserted me? On hearing this, some of the bystanders said, look, he's calling for Elijah. One ran and soaked a sponge in vinegar, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. Wait, he said, let's see if Elijah will come and take him down. But Yeshua let out a loud cry and gave up his spirit. And the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the Roman officer who stood facing him saw the way he gave up his spirit, he said, this man really was a son of God. There were women looking on from a distance, and among them were Mary from Magdala, Mary, the mother of the younger James and Joseph, now, what's that in English? Shlomit is what it's called in Hebrew. These women had followed him and helped him when he was in the Galilee, and many other women were there who had come up with him to Jerusalem.
Can you go?
Since it was...
Go on, yeah.
What do we got to 40?
Let's go all the way to 47.
Okay. Since it was preparation day, that is the day before a Sabbath, an evening approached. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, who was himself also looking forward to the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked him for Yeshua's body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead, so he summoned the officer and asked him if he'd been dead a while. After he'd got him confirmation from the officer that Yeshua was dead, he granted Joseph the corpse. Joseph purchased a linen sheet, and after taking Yeshua down, he wrapped him in the linen sheet, laid him in a tomb which had been cut out of the rock, and rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he had been laid.
Excellent. Thank you, Edmund. Welcome, Dave.
Hi there, everybody.
Dave.
So, Edmund, we actually got up to the tearing of the temple curtain last week, but I thought we'd recap. So, just in case you had any thoughts on from 33 through to 38.
Okay. There are obviously the quote from Psalm 22, but because I bump up against different people for whom it seems to be a matter of import, they claim that the Gospels, the New Testament was originally written in variously Aramaic, Hebrew, or Greek, and they all, seem to be very determined of their particular position. One of the things that I thought they're coming at this the wrong way round, and that Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, the Eloi, Eloi, that's actually Hebrew. but Lemak Sabachthani is Aramaic, which makes the point which I think that in that culture, they were a polyglot people. They were used to operating in all three languages, or if you were from outside Israel, you wouldn't be so regularly using Hebrew. But the person who I think is most likely to have got it right says that in your family, in your home, the language you spoke was Aramaic. If you were out in the market and mixing with lots of different people, you used Koine Greek, and legal documents and various other things like that, and readings in the synagogue, for example, and in school, that's where they would most likely use Hebrew. And you had a man in the synagogue who called the Methuagan, who was the one who would, not everybody would speak Hebrew. We get Greeks who Greek-speaking Jews referred to, meaning they didn't speak Hebrew, mentioned in the gospel, and they would be in the synagogue. And so you had someone who would give a free translation, both of the reading as he went along, and if he was, the homily afterwards, he would also, if necessary, relate that to various ones in the synagogue who didn't happen to use whichever language. And if you look in a number of different editions of the Bible, you will have come across at some point reference, usually in the footnotes, it'll say TG or TRG or Targum. And they were free-flowing translations, usually in Aramaic, of Bible passages. And they were used all the time in Israel in the first century. Everybody was very familiar with them. So rather than saying, is it this language or that language or the other, it's the people in those days would think you were very odd for making a big point about it. You know, they all read the scriptures in whichever version they could get their hands on. At least that's my reading of it. So there's that bit. And then in another point that sometimes I think people misunderstand, it says in verse 39, when the Roman officer who stood facing him saw the way he gave up his spirit, he said, this man really was a son of God. Now, some translations don't quite get it right because it is a son of God, whereas some translations will say the son of God, but it's actually a son of God. And including Messianic Jews will say there you are, you see, he was a God-fearer or something of that. But they misunderstand from a Jewish perspective. For instance, Caesar, when one of the Caesars died, say Julius Caesar, it would be reported that they saw strange weather phenomenon or a meteorite or something like that. And that would validate for them that the one who followed, being the son of the previous Caesar, he's the son. Caesar's clearly been received into the heavenlies because they saw something, signs and wonders in the skies. And therefore that proves he's a son of God. It doesn't mean he's divine. It means, he's clearly related to someone who the gods have accepted, the previous Caesar. And in point of fact, when you look at Celtic saints like Columba and whatnot, they often tell stories about when they die, they saw a comet or something like that. And that was just continuing on that idea of expecting to see strange phenomenon if this was a special person. So the soldier is really being very Roman and saying, oh, look at all this happening, whether it's the earthquake or the...
I'll deal with it later on.
or whatever, that he's just working within his culture. Wow, look at all these extraordinary things. There's been an eclipse or whatever. This guy must be really somebody, a son of God, rather than saying that he was believing in the Messiah.
Mm.
Yeah, on that verse, the commentator says that at the baptism there was the rending of the sky and the declaration of the sonship of Jesus, and at his death, the rending of the curtain and the Gentile declaration of sonship. So the commentator sees like a mirror of Jesus's baptism in this.
Oh.
I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I think. The thing is, God is very good at doing stuff which will speak to you wherever you are. Do you know what I mean? It will speak to a Roman. Oh, something very big has now happened. And the same way it will speak to Jews and all sorts of things. You don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just to say, if you're talking to Muslims, that bit there, Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. There are two positions if you're a Muslim, but one of them comes down to this point. They point to this point and say that he wasn't really dead. That's one of their positions. And you can tell because people lived longer being crucified, and Pilate was surprised. So he wasn't really dead. That's one of their arguments using that verse there.
Which is odd because Mark uses that and raises it rather than avoids the question, but then answers it that because he questioned it, he sent the centurion to check.
Yeah.
So I think that's a pretty weak argument, to be honest. If they'd have not
but we all
mentioned...
do that to support our point of view, don't we? We pick the verse we like and
Yes.
often don't read it in context.
Yeah. I mean, the commentator says that those executed for treason forfeited the right to burial, and bodies were often left to rot on the cross.
Yeah.
Release to burial depended on the generosity of the magistrate.
Yeah.
So he had to go and petition to get the body down. Do you know any more on that, Edmund? Because do you or anybody any background on in Israel whether they took the bodies off the crosses or left them there?
If I saw something recently which seemed to be saying, and it fits in with what you were saying, that ordinary common criminals, but if it was very unusual for anybody other than although they rather forgot that later on, you wouldn't really expect high status people to be crucified except under unusual circumstances, you know, the leader of a revolt or something like that. So having wealthy friends come and say, can we have the body? I mean, Joseph of Arimathea was clearly a significant figure and known to Pilate.
Yeah.
So he has some considerable, I mean, he's a member of the Sanhedrin for a kickoff. But it sounds to me when I read it, the way he can wander into Pilate, you know what I mean, that he's...
It sounds like he's got Herodian tendencies.
Why is that?
Well, because the Herodians were the kind of the bridge, weren't they? The Herodians were really the ones who kind of were Jewish, or tended to be Jewish and beyond the pale, because they almost went sort of native, went Roman.
Yeah.
Although being in the Sanhedrin, well, I don't know. Yes, he could have been there. He could have been, but you also had Nicodemus involved as well.
Yeah, because they both bring the burial
Yes.
spices, don't
That's
they?
right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So certainly he must have had access.
yeah. And I think it also struck me that Pilate would be a bit miffed because it twice said, I'm just going to give him a whipping and then I'm going to release him. And he almost gets pushed into with the thing about being friend of Caesar. By the way, which I always get a bit frustrated when they talk about Israel as being this place of the sticks and a place you got shoved off to. If he has Pilate is a friend of Caesar, he's quite high status in the terms of things. And to be the governor of a province, not every governor of a province had the right to execute, but Pilate has the right to execute, and he's called a friend of Caesar, which means he's in the inner circle. And I think the response of the church traditionally down the years to saying, oh, this was a rubbish place, is partly to do with their attitude to the Jews. I was reading Constantine's letters, quite shocking in places, when he's talking about why the Easter celebrations and stuff, there's no way we're going to have it on the same day as the perfidious Jews. And he says some pretty, and so the sort of view of Jews and Israel was, they describe it in the most dismissive terms. But I don't think, it's at the center of major trade routes, very, very important, which is why it got fought over so important. So to say it's a sort of backwater place, which so many of the scholar books say, and it's just nonsense. I really don't believe that. I think that's part of us buying into we've replaced the Jews and therefore we describe them in the worst possible terms. And I think Pilate is a bit miffed about having been maneuvered into having to, I've written what I've written. I'm not changing it. I think he'd be quite pleased if, can I have the body of Jesus? Here's another way of getting his own back, having been pushed into this situation, because it was not usual to, or not common to.
Certainly not to. If it was usually the friends and family who petitioned for the body, but it doesn't say Joseph was a friend. But it says those executed for high treason were always denied burial, and all criminals were buried some distance outside of Jerusalem. That Pilate allowed the burial and handing over of the body to a non-family member indicates Pilate did not consider Jesus guilty as charged of treason.
Yeah.
Because he was making a statement. This body isn't going to be buried outside of some distance outside of the city. It is going to be buried. I am handing it over. So it was a statement.
As far as I understand from the archaeology, there are only a few archaeological sort of remains, bones, with marks of crucifixion on them. There's the famous one with the actual nails still through the heel. But they're very few. Most bones are intact. That they've all the ossuaries that they've opened. So it suggests that they didn't get. And of course, that was the highest disgrace. The highest, even a priest. The highest thing, honor that he could do to a person, even on a high holy day, like Passover, would be to bury somebody. That would be the highest mitzvot.
Because they can't repay you.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, Nicodemus, who was probably the head of the school, and Joseph, they put themselves out of action for the rest of the holiday.
I saw a documentary this week. They're doing a series being, it's called, and the first one was Jewish. And it was interesting because they explained about the things behind the burials of people, and they are you have a special group of people from your local community who undertake as a mitzvot that you were just talking about, Dave, to prepare people for burial, and it's done within 24 hours normally, and they wash them and prepare them, and nobody has shoes. They're all buried, whether you're very, very famous or just an ordinary person, in the same very simple coffin. There's no difference. She said that the family are not told which people in the local group, I can't remember the name for the group, that always do this. It's part of their service, the last service they can give to a person. And she mentioned what I was saying earlier about because they can't pay you. So the burial of people is a very highly respected thing in Orthodox Judaism. Was very interesting.
Yeah, just looking at the commentator is talking about the tomb and also the preparation of the body, and he says, though it was not mentioned, the washing of the body was considered so important it was allowed on the Sabbath. So they would have washed and prepared the body before they wrapped it with the spices, which were obviously to cover the nasty smell of a decaying body. And then placed in a tomb. It's saying that the Holy Sepulchre, which is kind of identified, it's our identification of where that tomb was, is known to have been a cemetery in the 1st century. And it was an abandoned quarry. And quite often when stonecutters had worked their way back into the hillside, they were then used for tombs. And it says, the facade cut into the hillside opened into an antechamber, at the back of which was a rectangular doorway about 2 feet high, which led further inside. And he references John 25 and 11. They stooped to look inside. Burial itself took place within that inner chamber. And then it was ordinarily, the tomb was sealed with a flat stone slab, wedged into place to shut out animals or intruders. The Markan account speaks of some sort of stone which could be rolled into place. This may have been only a boulder, but if the tomb was an exceptionally fine one, it may have had an elaborate disc-shaped stone, about a yard in diameter like a millstone, which was placed in a wide slot cut into the rock. Since the groove into which the stone fitted sloped towards the doorway, it could be easily rolled into place, but to roll the stone aside would require the strength of several men. Only a few tombs with such rolling stones are known in Palestine, but all of them date from the period of Jesus. So there you go.
I've just seen a couple of notes in this study Bible, which sort of go along with it. It says, the preparation of the body for burial is considered one of the more important commandments or good deeds, mitzvot, to be purchased. It is exemplary because it is a good deed that cannot be returned. Following proper washing and cleansing, the deceased body is clothed with a white robe or shroud, modelled after the priestly garments worn in the temple. The symbolism of the simple shroud is striking. The rabbis encourage simplicity as a way of keeping a proper perspective in death. We are all equal, regardless of our station in life. That is also why no shoes are placed on the body, so there is no difference between rich and poor.
So, any comments, any thoughts? We haven't talked about the women really, have we? Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. I mean, this kind of gives you a bit of background that you just don't get anywhere else, really, doesn't it?
And it's interesting that Hebrew University, the people there studying the Gospels, pointing out to us unknowing Gentiles, which always amuses me, that do you understand that Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus, is one of the few Jewish rabbis who have women disciples, and they say that they are absolutely convinced by at least 7, and the women are much more present than most Christians seem to understand in their picture of what it was like.
How present were they? I mean, when we say disciples, they weren't on the same level as the 12? Or
well, the female disciples, Hillel, we know Hillel had them as well. Shammai definitely did not. No, definitely did not. They're not sure about Gamaliel. They think he may have had an odd female disciple or two, but it's not clear. But they're absolutely clear Hillel did, and they say Jesus very definitely did, and you Christians don't seem to understand that, basically.
I read something some time ago, and I can't remember what book it was in, but it was about how women disciples are much more prominent than the scriptures would suggest in terms of their positions in being Jesus followers, but they've been sort of written out as a story by sexist male.
Oh, well, that's that lady I know. There is a book, I'm trying to remember, I can see her face, she really annoys me, but she's a feminist, but it's because we don't put them in their proper place that enables people. I mean, she likes Dan Brown and stuff as well, that woman, Pagel, somebody Pagel, I can't quite remember her name, but I've seen her on various documentaries, and I know what she's going to say every time she turns up as well.
Yeah, that's what I saw. The BBC documentary, I think it was, a year or so ago.
Yeah, I think that's Pagel is the lady.
Right.
And she's out there in the sort of, although because we're not balanced in our tradition, it leaves it open to get wild cards like her in there. Do you know what I mean? There's something there because, and that fits in also with, we were talking the other week about the Last Supper. Where are the women? Where are the other members of the household? Do you know what I mean? And I've been noticing how we know the passage where your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. We quote that one. But if you read very carefully, I think Mary and the family were around a lot more than we have in our heads.
Well, there must have been, because his brothers became senior leaders in the church, didn't they?
Yeah. And I mean, I've just read John today, and in John, the very beginning of John 7, if I just look this bit up, here we are. Go back a bit. John 7 opens up with the bit where his brothers, it's coming up for the feast, and they say, aren't you coming up to Jerusalem? Anybody wants to be anybody, and he says, I'm not going now. It goes up later. Here we are. John 7. After this, Yeshua traveled round in the Galilee, intentionally avoiding Judea because the Judeans were out to kill him. But the festival of Sukkot in Judea was near. So his brothers said to him, leave here and go into Judea so that your disciples can see the miracles you do. No one who wants to become known acts in secret. If you're doing these things, show yourself to the world. His brothers spoke this way because they had not put their trust in him. Yeshua said to them, my time has not yet come, but for you, any time is right. The world cannot hate you, but it does hate me because I keep telling it how wicked its ways are. You go up to the festival. As for me, I'm not going up to this festival now because the right time for me is not yet come. After this, he stayed on in Galilee. And so that they happen to be mentioned in John. And obviously at some point, they go from being unconvinced to being convinced, because it's almost all the way down to Constantine. It's not made a big deal of, but in Israel, descendants of the others of the family, let alone what we see in Acts with James and what have you, they are referenced in the early church documents as being around. But as soon as Constantine comes in, you don't get any mention of descendants of the family anymore. Which again, I think, is to do with let's rubbish the Jews.
Possibly. Going back
to the women again. I recall that it talks about Joanna.
Yeah, and Susanna. Yeah.
Yeah, Susanna. Yeah, in the from Herod's palace, who said that she supported his ministry out of her own funds.
Yeah, because she's married to Chusa, who's who runs the whole equivalent of the Viagra industry for the whole of the world at that time. So
it's again, so she would be, might well be considered to be a disciple of
definitely.
The
people in Jerusalem say, they quote exactly that passage and say there's reasons why the way it's referenced, and you've got people like Mary in Bethany, it says she was sitting at Jesus' feet.
Yes.
Well, that's always a term that you're a disciple.
Yeah.
The other thing that you notice, if you look at where all the women are mentioned, generally, if you sort of do a survey on men and women when they're mentioned, the men don't come off all that well.
No.
It's the women who are the ones of faith. And really positive. So that there's a totally different sort of spin on it, but we miss it.
Yeah, I don't know that you could claim Mark is misogynistic, because he makes it very clear who the witnesses to the resurrection are.
Yeah.
And the commentator makes it very clear that the testimony of a woman in Jewish culture had no value. And the commentator says that, because of that, their presence at the scene in the Markan account can only be explained as factual, because he wouldn't have made it up.
It validates it.
But he doesn't hide it either.
No.
Yeah, and I think it's at the end of Luke, when I think it's on the road to Emmaus. The point is, it's not so much that the disciples disbelieve the women, but they have to go and see it for themselves, because they can't argue to other people if there aren't male witnesses as well. So you've got, I think it's at the end of Luke. Let's just go back.
Yeah, Luke 24:24. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said.
That's saying, so it's a legal position now. It wasn't before, but they went and checked it. They validated it. So now it can be given as legal testimony.
But it says, and they found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. So Jesus appeared to the women, but not at that point.
It's only when they get back to Jerusalem that he turns up. Then they see him.
Let's move on whilst we've got time to chapter 16.
Ooh.
So, Edwin, let me just get this up.
Right, let's just find my way back to 16. There we go.
Can you do Mark 16, 1 to 8, please?
1 to 18.
1 to 8.
1 to 8, okay. When when the Sabbath was over, Mary of Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices in order to go and anoint Yeshua. Very early the next day, just after sunrise, they went to the tomb. They were asking each other, who can roll away the stone from the entrance to the tomb for us? And then they looked up and saw that the stone, even though it was huge, had been rolled back already. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right, and they were dumbfounded. But he said, "Don't be so surprised. You're looking for Yeshua from Nazareth, who was executed on the stake. He's risen. He's not here. Look at the place where they laid him. You'll see him there. But go and tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he's going to the Galilee ahead of you. You'll see him there just as he told you." Trembling, but ecstatic, they went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
And that is how Mark's gospel ends, according to the commentator, who doesn't give much truck to the alternative ending. Though there is a footnote. There is a shorter additional ending, which has got a lot more credence, apparently. The commentator says, were it not for his resurrection, Jesus of Nazareth might have appeared as no more than a line in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, if he were mentioned at all. The witness of the four Gospels is unequivocal that following the crucifixion, Jesus' disciples were scattered, their hopes shattered by the course of events. What halted the dissolution of the messianic movement centered in Jesus was the resurrection. So, and on verse 5, it says, the emptiness of the tomb possessed no factual value in itself. It simply raised the question, what happened to the body? God therefore sent his messenger to disclose the fact of the resurrection. The announcement of the angel is the crystallization point of faith. It says that the witness to the resurrection were women was an inconvenient and troublesome fact for the church, for the testimony lacked no value as evidence in Jewish law. The primitive community would not have invented this detail, which can only be explained on the ground that it was factual. The proclamation of the resurrection to a devout Jew would indicate that the day of judgment was at hand. The apparent abrupt ending in verse 8 is consistent with the motives of astonishment and fear developed throughout the gospel. So, Edmund, any thoughts on this original ending of the gospel?
Well, I've come across, you look at all the different things they say, but two things have struck me over the years. And I don't know how accurate one of them is, but they're saying that one suggestion is that the bit that followed on has been lost. And the other thing is, so that then you get this later, you then get the additional 12 to the end, or variants thereof, and I've got in the annotated Jewish New Testament, they got about 5 different options, some of which I've never seen anywhere else. But the other thing is, it's interesting, the length of the Gospels. Luke and Matthew are pretty much the same number of words. I mean, in chapters, they're different, but it's a full-length scroll. It's a full-length scroll. Mark is almost exactly half a scroll. And so, you find yourself wondering, did he
just run out of space?
standard sizes for scrolls, you know, and he's writing one, and you think, oh well, I better finish this off.
Yes.
Sorry.
That's him. I mean, that's just a little curiosity for me when I suddenly realised that scrolls came in particular sizes, and you suddenly realise, although it's 28 and 24, that it's actually very, very similar in length. There are more chapters in Matthew. Some of the chapters are shorter than they are in Luke. You know what I mean? So it's almost so close to being the same length. And Mark is almost exactly half the length of both of those. So I just found that, I always find that just niggles away in the back of my mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the commentator's quite clear that there's no evidence in the earliest manuscripts that it went beyond 8. And it's only in later iterations that you find the numerous additional endings that people put in because they felt it did end too abruptly.
Yeah.
So yeah, he doesn't even comment on anything from verse 8 onwards.
But I think they're interesting. I mean, verse 12, after that, Yeshua appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into, that's clearly the Emmaus Road.
Yeah,
so they're sort of reflecting on bits and cobbling it together, but it seemed to turn into somebody else a bit further down. So there's bits cobbled together here, you know. Later, Yeshua appeared to the 11 as they were eating, and that bit. And then it turns to, the feel is different. So, you know, it just, yeah.
Yeah, there's a footnote in the NIV that's on Bible Hub. It says, some manuscripts have the following ending between verses 8 and 9, and one manuscript has it after verse 8, omitting verses 9 to 20. Then they quickly reported all these instructions to those around Peter. After this, Jesus himself also sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. And the commentator thinks there's more evidence of that being early than the others, but not original to Mark.
It's interesting, though. I've got a note in here which says, verses 9 to 20 are found in many ancient Greek manuscripts, but not in the 2 oldest ones. So, it's only 2, the 2 oldest, that it doesn't appear in. So it's not as if there were lots of examples of it stopping there. It's just 2. So
but why?
We have to be a little...
But the question, I don't think you have to do a statistical counting up of how many it appears in. It's like, if it's not in the earliest, why wasn't it in the earliest and it then appeared in the later ones?
Well, you've got a situation, say, with Luke. Preachers, and I grew up with them, would often say about Luke when he's talking about the woman with the issue of blood. The other gospel writers say she spent all her money on physicians but had got no better. But Luke doesn't have it. Well, it turns out that's
professional courtesy, Edmund. Professional courtesy.
Yes.
Well, the trouble is that that's not right. It depends. You know, I said there are 2 main streams for translations. It is in the older one, but not in the later one. And what they think is it dropped out for a period, but they think it was originally in Luke, but then lost it at the time when the other parallel text. So what I mean is things can drop in and out of texts, and who knows if we might not, it might not be that for those 2 manuscripts, which are the oldest we know of, but it had
quite a big passage to drop out. I'm ambivalent about it. Olivia, what did they teach you in college?
Yeah, I actually can't remember. I feel like we're having a discussion. It might be original, it might not be, which is probably what we would have discussed. But I think my question is, how are we meant to read it? What do we do with these texts that are supposedly later insertions? And, it's sort of, for me, like the question of the Apocrypha maybe, and which we kind of throw out completely, or certain verses in the Bible that we say, well, they don't appear so much, or they're just contextual. Like, how do we read this book? Is every word equally weighted or not? I think that's the discussion I want to have.
I worry about putting our scholastic notions on it, because I think for the people of the time, they didn't come at it that way. I remember I don't know, I might have mentioned it before, the rabbi over in Georgia that I'd sit in on each week, he really does not like the Codex Sinaiticus, I think is the one. It may be the other one, but whichever one it is. And he described it as got all these extra bits added in and crossings out and all sorts of stuff. And he really goes to town whenever differences crop up, and one doesn't like the NIV because it's from that one, and all this sort of thing. And I happened to see a documentary talking about ancient books, and it showed you the pages of the Codex Sinaiticus that he was talking about. And I looked at it and I thought, there are no crossings out on the pages. It's most beautifully written. And you've got in another ink written alongside the emendations that he's talking about. And what it reminded me was a picture of the Torah with comments and additional readings. It wasn't somebody crossing something out and putting alternatives. It was like we have footnotes in our Bibles, and they were all there, all the other readings from different things. And it was the most beautiful books. It was like looking at the Book of Kells. Do you know what I mean? And I suddenly thought, our headspace, that isn't what they're doing. They're saying this is the main text, and these are variants that come in the other manuscripts. It wasn't the no crossings out, corrections, anything like that, but that's how the tradition had come down to that guy in Georgia. And he'd clearly not seen the codex himself to describe it as crossings out and alternate translations. And I think people were much more relaxed about, they didn't come at it in the way we do.
I'm wondering if so I don't know if I'm going to sound like a heretic here, but I wonder if
we're on record, Olivia, so we can,
I'll get shot by email. Whether we've, in our elevation of our intellects, whether we have elevated the word in a wrong way. So we're idolizing the actual words, and it's a living word. It's the truth of the living word. And so if we get too hung up on what is, I don't know, textually correct, we're kind of missing the point, really. Yeah. That's how I see it. I see, well, yes, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but quite honestly, it holds together very coherently. Verses 9 to the end with the rest of the New Testament. So actually, I don't know.
Well, it may not have been written by Mark, but it's a very early testimony. And the fact
there's something I'm curious about, which is that it mentions speaking in tongues, which surely was unknown until, Acts chapter 2, which would have been in the future. So that suggests it's added later, obviously.
No, Mark was written later than...
Mark was written later in Rome, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But he's quoting Jesus. So was Jesus prophesying this ahead of what happened at Pentecost? Or was this informed because it was later, as Dave says? I mean, it's obviously an early recollection from, there were so many early recollections. The trouble comes is that if you start looking at the huge selection of early recollections, you know, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, there's no like hard and fast rule about where you stop your theology, because they're not in scripture, because they were decided that they were just a little bit too flaky. And you don't want to start, you know, once you go down that road, it's like, well, where do you stop? Because you just keep on going wider and wider.
I mean, I have two things I go for. And you guys know me, so you're not going to take me out and burn me at the stake. But
I wouldn't make that assumption, Edmund.
Make my point that
there's always a first time.
I do not take the Bible as the bottom line. I do not take the Bible as the bottom line.
Interesting. Explain.
Jesus said, you search the scriptures because you think that in them you have life, and yet it is they that speak of me, and yet you will not come to me. And therefore, the bottom line is not the Bible. The bottom line is me standing before Jesus. Now, you guys know I am absolutely immersed in my Bible. I love my Bible. Well, it was hard work, like learning the piano to begin with, but I worked at it and worked at it and worked at it. And I have read this thing over 100 times, and the New Testament more than 300 times. You know, so I love my Bible, but it is not my bottom line. My bottom line is Jesus, and I look at the scriptures through the lens of that relationship. And so I'm not so fussed about whether it's this word here and that word in another translation. A little thing that cropped up just this week, bless him, one of Wayne's things he gets very worked up about Easter and Christmas, because he says Easter is named for a well, he says Astarte, but it's actually named for a Celtic goddess Easter. It's where we get the word estrogen and all that sort of thing, the female deity. But the thing is, I happened to hear the Pope's message on Easter Day, and something really hit me. In Italian, and similar in Latin, Buona Pascha. They talk about a Paschal candle, for example. And you know where Pascha comes from? Pesach.
Pesach, yes.
It's from the Hebrew. So it's only the fact that the King James translators put Easter in there instead of Passover, because that's English. All the other people all relate it back to the Hebrew. Well, at least the Roman Catholic Church does. So you suddenly think, oh dear, it's because we're English that we use the word Easter. It's not to do with...
It's not in scripture.
No, sorry?
It's not in the Bible.
Have a look in the King James Version.
Well, it's not in
It uses the word Easter.
Right. Does it?
Yep. Wayne points it out every time and says the Pope determined that it would not be Passover, it was going to be called Easter. But in fact, that's just an accident of English.
Well, as we're nearly out of time and we're nearly out of Mark, would you like to hear another ending to Mark, which is called the Freer Logion? It says, in certain exemplars, and especially in the Greek manuscripts of the Gospel according to Mark, at the end of his Gospel, there is written, afterward, when the 11 reclined at meal, Jesus appeared to them and upbraided them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after his resurrection. And they made excuse, saying, this age of iniquity and unbelief is under Satan, who, through unclean spirits, does not permit the true power of God to be apprehended. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now. And the Messiah said to them that the limit of the years of the authority of Satan has been fulfilled, but other terrible things are drawing near. And on behalf of those who have sinned, I was delivered to death, in order that they might turn to the truth and sin no more, in order that they might inherit this spiritual, incorruptible glory, which is in heaven, which consists in righteousness. So there's another alternative ending too.
Yeah,
Mark.
that's one of the ones I'd never seen that one till I saw it in the.
Yeah, so there are a number of them, but the just to end on a really nice technical note to prove that we are really theologians. He says the earliest Greek versional and patristic evidence supports the conclusion that Mark ended his gospel at chapter 16, verse 8. To the witness of the two earliest parchment codices, Vaticanus B and Sinaiticus, may be added minuscules 304 and 2386. The absence of chapter 16, 9 to 20 in the Old Latin MSK, the Sinaitic Syriac, several MSS of the Armenian version, the Yiddish and Opisa MSS of the Georgian version, and a number of MSS of the Ethiopic version provides a wide range of support for the originality of the abrupt ending. Writing in the 4th century, Eusebius remarked that accurate copies of Mark ended with verse 8, adding that chapters 16, 9 to 20 were missing from almost all MSS, and the original form of the Eusebian sections make no provision for numbering sections after chapter 16, verse 8. Jerome echoes this testimony when he says of the last 12 verses of Mark that almost all the Greek codices do not have this concluding portion. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Cyprian, and Cyril of Jerusalem show no awareness of the existence of these verses. Amen.
Right. But out of interest, if you're interested in that Easter in the King James, it's Acts 12, verse 4.
Acts 12, verse 4. Let's have a look what we've got. Acts 12,
it reads,
verse 4.
And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people.
It says unleavened bread.
Yeah, but the translators
Passover,
turned it into Easter.
All right. Well, it says, yeah, it's got unleavened bread and Passover in my NIV.
Yeah, only the King James.
Well,
I haven't
guys,
looked at the ASV.
We have finished Mark. I'm going to stop the recording now.